Hello, Triden and Nagar, and welcome to our new series where we will be solving Paper 1 Classified. Now, today we're going to be solving Topic 8, Transport in Mammals, from 2023 to 2022. And this is going to be Part 1. And before we start, I'd highly appreciate it if you would take a moment to subscribe to this channel and like this video. You will find a copy of the PDF with the answer key in the description box down below in our new website. And now, attention all AS Biology Cambridge students. We have some incredible news to share with you today. We are thrilled to announce the launch of our brand new website. And guess what? It comes with an exciting bonus. Free notes for topics 1, 2, 3, and 4. Simply log in and press File Share to receive your free notes. Plus, you can post any questions you have or have any discussions in our group's feed. Question number 1. The photomicrograph shows a section through a tissue with an artery, which row correctly shows the type of artery and whether the blood inside the artery is oxygenated or deoxygenated. First of all, you must notice that the area around this artery is actually the alveoli. Therefore, we are now in the lungs. And you must know that the artery or the pulmonary artery actually carries deoxygenated blood. Therefore, the blood is going to be deoxygenated. Now, we must know what type of artery it is. If we zoom in, this is a little tip outside the syllabus. However, if you clearly see this part, this is called the internal elastic lamina. And the tunica intima has or constitutes that internal elastic lamina. And it is made from its name from elastic tissue or elastic fibers. Therefore, if this were to be an elastic artery, you wouldn't actually differentiate between the tunica media and the tunica intima. Why? Because they're made of the same elastic tissue. However, this is a muscular artery because you can actually differentiate between the internal elastic lamina, which is made of elastic fibers, and the tunica intima, which is mainly made of muscular tissue. Therefore, this is why this should be a muscular artery, and the answer is going to be A. Question number 2. Heart surgery may cause a decrease in the transmission of impulses in the Purkinje tissue to the right side of the heart. What is a possible effect of this decrease? First of all, you must know that we have something called a sinoatrial node in the right atrium. The sinoatrial node emits impulses, which passes through something called the AVN, atrioventricular node, which slightly delays this impulse. The reason for this is so that the atrium and the ventricles do not contract at the same time. Therefore, what happens is that impulse passes down through the bundle of His and up to the apex to something called the Purkinje tissue. Now, the heart surgery caused a decrease in the transmission of impulses to the Purkinje tissue, to the right side of the heart. Therefore, it is normal that what happens is that the ventricle takes longer to actually contract. So let's see the suggestions that we have here. A. Impulses would be delayed by the atrioventricular node. First of all, the impulses would not be delayed because it starts from the sinoatrial node. And the atrioventricular node already delays that impulse, therefore this is incorrect. B. The muscle of the right ventricle would contract slightly more slowly than the muscle of the left ventricle. This is correct because we said that the transmission is delayed at the Purkinje tissue in the right side, and we said it's at the apex, therefore it's at the ventricle. Therefore this is correct. C. The muscle of the right atrium would not contract as fully as the muscle of the left atrium. We just mentioned that the Purkinje tissue is actually found at the ventricle, therefore this is incorrect. The sinoatrial node would transmit fewer impulses. We also said that the Purkinje tissue has nothing to do with the sinoatrial node, which determines the impulse rate. Therefore, this is incorrect, and the answer is going to be B. 3. The diagram shows a network of blood vessels that supply blood to the muscle tissue in the human body. What is the correct comparison between the blood at X and the blood at Y when the muscle tissue is at rest? First of all, you must identify that X is the arteriole, Y is the capillary bed, and this area here is the venule. Now, blood pressure at X compared with the blood pressure at Y. So, the closer we are to the heart, aka the artery, the higher the blood pressure, and as we go along to the vein, it keeps decreasing. Therefore, the blood pressure at X must be higher. Now, water potential of blood at X compared with the water potential of blood at Y. So, as we all know, when blood passes through the capillary bed, what happens is that some liquid leaves through called the tissue fluid. Therefore, fluid is lost from the capillary bed. Therefore, the water potential at Y would actually be lower because fluid is being lost. Therefore, the water potential of blood at X compared with water potential of blood at Y would be higher. Therefore, the answer is going to be C. Question number 4. Scientists have shown that the oxygen dissociation curves for hemoglobin of smaller mammals are to the right of those of large mammals. What does this suggest about the hemoglobin of smaller mammals? First of all, when the oxygen dissociation curve shifts to the right, this means that it has a lower affinity to oxygen. It needs a higher partial pressure of oxygen to achieve a particular saturation. Now, let's see the suggestions that we have here. A. At lower partial pressures of oxygen, it binds to oxygen more strongly. Now, this is incorrect because we said when it shifts to the right, this means it has a lower affinity, therefore binds less strong. B. It saturates with oxygen at lower partial pressures of oxygen than the hemoglobin of larger mammals. As we said, this is incorrect. It requires a higher partial pressure to achieve a particular saturation. So this is incorrect. C. It releases oxygen more easily than the hemoglobin of larger mammals. This is correct because it has a lower affinity to the oxygen. For D, when the partial pressure of oxygen is high, it carries more oxygen than the hemoglobin of larger mammals. As we said, this assumes that the affinity is higher, so this is incorrect, and the answer is going to be C. Question number 5. What is an effect of an increased concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood? So, as we all know, when carbon dioxide increases, what happens is in the red blood cell, there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. What happens is that the carbon dioxide combines with water, and then, in a reversible reaction, carbonic acid forms by the action of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Now, this carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The bicarbonate leaves to the plasma to be carried. Therefore, carbon dioxide is indirectly carried in the plasma. Also, increased carbon dioxide could bind to the globin part of hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin. So the concentration of carbaminohemoglobin increases. Now let's see the suggestion that we have here. A. Increased movement of chloride ions out of the red blood cell. So out is incorrect. Now let's discuss the phenomenon of chloride shift. First of all, going back to the point of carbonic acid, we must know that carbonic anhydrase forms carbonic acid, which dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Now, inside the red blood cell, what happens? We know that hydrogen ions are impermeable. They can't actually leave the red blood cell. However, as we discussed earlier, the bicarbonate ions leave the red blood cell, which are negatively charged, to be transported in the plasma. Now, by common sense, what would happen? If negative charge keeps leaving the red blood cell and the hydrogen ions, which are positive, keeps accumulating inside the cell, what would happen? Then the red blood cell would have a net positive charge. Now, what happens to balance this phenomenon is something called the chloride shift. Now, chloride ions, which are negatively charged, re-enter the red blood cell to balance out the charges of the movement of bicarbonate ions outside the red blood cell. Now, this is the chloride shift. Now, the mistake here is that it says out of the red blood cell. Actually, the chloride ions go inside the red blood cell, opposite to the movement of bicarbonate ions. Therefore, this is incorrect. Now, for B, increased concentration of hemoglobinic acid. We've discussed this earlier, so this is correct. C, decreased concentration of hydrogen carbonate ions in the blood plasma. This is incorrect. We said that they increase in amount and be transported in the plasma, so this is incorrect. It actually increases. Now, decreased concentration of carbaminohemoglobin, also this is incorrect. It increases. Therefore, the answer is going to be B. Question number 6. Which statements about the cardiac cycle are correct? 1. Atrioventricular valves close during atrial systole. So atrial systole is the contraction of the atrium. Now what happens when the atrium contracts is that it pushes blood throughout the atrioventricular valves. Therefore, they actually open, don't close. Therefore, this is incorrect. 2. The left and right ventricles contract together. Yes, already the left and right do contract together at the same time by impulses coming from the AVN node to both the Purkinje fibers at the same time. Therefore, this is why they contract together. And the atrium also contract together. However, the atrium and the ventricles do not contract together. Now for 3. There is a time delay as the electrical impulse passes from the atrioventricular node to the sinoatrial node. Now the order here is incorrect. Now you must know that the sinoatrial node is at the right atrium. And now the impulses pass to the atrioventricular node, which indeed delays the impulse. Therefore, this is incorrect. For 4, electrical impulses pass along the Purkinje tissue to the ventricles. We must know that the Purkinje tissue are at the apex of the ventricles at both sides. So the impulses passes from the AVN to the bundle of His, then goes upwards to the Purkinje fibers. Therefore, this is correct. And the answer is 2 and 4. Therefore, it's going to be C. Question number 34. At what point in the cardiac cycle, the pressure in the right ventricle is lower than that in the right atrium and lower than that in the pulmonary artery? Which row is correct? So, if the pressure in the right ventricle is lower than the right atrium, this means that right now we're in atrial systole. The atrium is contracting, therefore the pressure in the atrium is higher. In this case, the atrioventricular valves are going to be open because if the atrium are contracting, they're pushing blood through the atrioventricular valves. Therefore, the pressure here is increased and they open. Now, for the semilunar valve, they actually remain closed because this is atrial systole. What happens is that the pressure in the ventricle is actually very low. Therefore, the semilunar valve remains closed and the answer is going to be C. Question number 8. Which statements about the formation of hemoglobinic acid are correct? Now, first of all, let's discuss the action of carbonic anhydrase enzyme. First of all, we know that inside the red blood cell, there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. What happens is that carbon dioxide combines with water, and carbonic anhydrase converts this reaction to carbonic acid. Now, what happens is that the carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and hydrogen carbonate ions. The hydrogen carbonate ions leave the red blood cell to be transported in the plasma, while the hydrogen ions accumulate inside the red blood cell. Now what happens is that these hydrogen ions, due to the increase of carbon dioxide, they will also increase. Therefore, what happens is that these hydrogen ions combine with hemoglobin forming hemoglobinic acid. Now we understand the phenomenon. Let's see the suggestions that we have here. 1. It is linked to the action of carbonic anhydrase. Yes, indirectly. We've just discussed that line. Therefore, this is correct. 2. It prevents blood from becoming too acidic by removing excess hydrogen ions. This is correct because when hydrogen ions combine with hemoglobin, this does remove the load of hydrogen ions. Therefore, this is also correct. 3. It can only occur when oxygen associates with hemoglobin. This is incorrect because here we're talking about the increase in concentration of carbon dioxide, not necessarily the oxygen association. Therefore, the answer is 1 and 2 and is going to be B. Number 36, the graph shows the association curves for hemoglobin at 2 different partial pressures of carbon dioxide. At which position on the graph would most chloride ions be found in red blood cells? Now, we've just discussed the chloride shift. The chloride shift is a phenomenon that takes place inside red blood cells where chloride ions enter the red blood cell to compensate for the hydrogen carbonate ions leaving. Now, I'll explain the phenomenon. What happens when the concentration of carbon dioxide increases? It combines with water inside red blood cell. Now, by the action of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, it forms carbonic acid. Now, what happens is that carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and hydrogen carbonate ions. Now, what happens is that inside the red blood cell, the hydrogen ions are actually impermeable. They cannot leave, while the hydrogen carbonate ions, which are negatively charged, are able to leave the red blood cells. Therefore, what happens by using common sense is that the positive charges would accumulate inside the red blood cell. Now, to balance this phenomenon, the negatively charged chloride ions enters the red blood cell to compensate for the hydrogen carbonate ions leaving to the plasma. Therefore, increased chloride ions inside the red blood cell is an indication that carbon dioxide concentration have increased. Therefore, we want the answer which has a higher concentration of carbon dioxide and indeed would have a lower partial pressure of oxygen. Now let's see the suggestions that we have here. Now, we must know that this is an optimized answer, by the way. This part here with a low carbon dioxide partial pressure, aka a higher percentage saturation of oxygen, would definitely be the lung. And we must know that in body tissues, in a lower partial pressure of oxygen and higher concentration of carbon dioxide would be B, aka body tissues. Therefore, the answer is going to be B. Question number 10. Edema is caused by the accumulation of tissue fluid around body cells. What would increase the amount of tissue fluid around body cells, aka what would cause edema? Now, first of all, you must know that the amount of tissue fluid is determined by two things. First of all, the water potential. So let's assume this is a blood vessel. So the water potential inside and outside the blood vessel, and the osmotic balance. And the amount of tissue fluid is determined by a balance of both. Now, what could actually increase the amount of tissue fluid, aka fluid leaving the blood vessels? Could be one thing, which is decrease in proteins. As we all know, that plasma is mostly made of proteins. And when proteins in the plasma decrease, for example, due to a liver disease, what happens is that water potential inside the blood vessels increase. When water potential inside the blood vessels increase, therefore the osmotic balance decreased. And what would happen is that due to the increased water potential, it will start leaving to body tissues. And then tissue fluid would accumulate around body cells. That's an example. Now let's see the suggestions that we have here. A, lower blood pressure than normal. So blood pressure does not impact the water potential or the osmotic balance. Blood pressure is just the rate of blood flow around the body per time. Therefore, this is incorrect. B, lower blood plasma protein concentration than normal. This is correct. We just discussed why. C, higher blood plasma protein. Now, this is incorrect. If this were the case, this means that the osmotic force here inside the blood vessel increased. This means that actually water would enter the blood vessel if the blood plasma protein increased. Therefore, this is incorrect. D, lower tissue fluid protein concentration than normal. Now, tissue fluid is the fluid outside the blood vessel. We're talking about what's inside the blood vessel, the forces between the osmotic and the water potential. Therefore, this is incorrect. And the answer is going to be B. Number 11, the table shows some information about three blood vessels P, Q, and R from a mammal. Which row identifies blood vessels P, Q, and R? First of all, you must identify the composition of each blood vessel. Let's start with the easier. We know that the capillary only consists of endothelium. Therefore, they do not have muscle, neither collagen, neither elastic tissue. Therefore, capillary is definitely incorrect. Now, let's see A and D. Now, we know that the composition of an artery is mainly tunica media. So the tunica media, aka the middle layer, is the larger in the arteries rather than veins. Veins have the larger layer is going to be the tunica externa. Now, let's go back to the artery. Since we've mentioned that the tunica media is the thicker or the greater layer, therefore it's going to have a higher composition of elastic tissue because tunica media is mainly consists of elastic tissue. Therefore, it makes more sense that B is going to be an artery. Now, regarding Q, we've just mentioned that veins have a greater tunica externa. And tunica externa consists mainly of collagen. Therefore, the blood vessel with the greater collagen composition is going to be a vein. Therefore, this is a vein due to the higher collagen composition. Now, regarding R, we just mentioned that this cannot be a capillary since capillaries do not contain all three layers, which are tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa. They indeed contain only an endothelium. Therefore, let's see the suggestions that we have here. Here for muscle we have 35, for collagen we have 25, and elastic tissue we have 30. Here we could see that the composition of elastic tissue is slightly greater than collagen. This is an indication that the tunica media is greater than the tunica externa, or thicker than the tunica externa. Therefore, this makes sense that it is actually an artery. Therefore, the answer is going to be A. Ventricular septal defects is a heart defect that people can have from birth. People with VSD have a hole in the wall septum that separates the left and right ventricles. What could happen in a person with VSD? So here, it's a hole in the septum that separates the left and the right ventricles. Therefore, blood could move right and left. Now, let's see the suggestions that we have here. 1. Blood will leak through the hole, mostly from right to left. Now, this is incorrect because if you think about it, where is the greater pressure? Which side has the greater pressure? Of course, it's the left, since it's the thicker or the more muscular side of the heart. Therefore, it makes more sense to have the greater pressure. If it has the greater pressure, this means that blood would actually go from left to right. Therefore, this is incorrect. For 2, the volume of blood circulating through the lungs would be higher than in a person without VSD. This is correct because if you think about it, we've just mentioned that blood actually moves from the left ventricle to the right ventricle. And as we also know, that in the right ventricle, this goes to the lung via the pulmonary artery. Therefore, there will be more blood going through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. Therefore, this is correct. 3, less oxygen will be delivered to body tissues. This is correct. The reason for this is that the oxygenated blood in the left side keeps moving to the right-hand side. Therefore, what happens is that the blood in the left decreases, which is actually oxygenated, and goes back to the lung. So it just keeps going in a loop from the right ventricle to the lung. Therefore, less oxygen will be delivered to body tissues due to the decrease of blood in the left side. Therefore, the answer is going to be D. Question number 13. Which statement about the structure of the heart is correct? A. The semilunar valves close when the pressure in the ventricle falls lower than the pressure in the arteries. This is correct because what happens in atrial systole or in diastole is that the pressure in the ventricle is lower. Therefore, it is not enough to push the semilunar valves open. The semilunar valves, for those who don't know, is the valve between the ventricles and the arteries. Therefore, if the pressure in the ventricles is lower, it cannot push the semilunar valves open. Therefore, this is correct. For B, a muscle called the septum separates the atria from the ventricles. This is totally incorrect. The reason for this is that the tissue or the muscle in the middle of the heart is called the septum, and it separates the right-hand side of the heart from the left-hand side. What separates the atria from the ventricles is actually the horizontal valves. The atrioventricular valves is what separates the upper layer, which is the atrium, from the ventricles. Therefore, this is incorrect. See, there's a small patch of tissue in the right atrium that acts to delay the electrical impulse. So in the right atrium is actually the sinoatrial node, and it initiates the impulse that goes to the atrioventricular node that delays the impulse. The atrioventricular node is in the middle, it's not in the right atrium. What's in the right atrium is the sinoatrial node, which only initiates the electrical impulse. Therefore, this is incorrect. The closure of valves in the veins prevents the backflow of blood into the ventricles. So, the valves in veins, if you think about it, is way far from the heart. Here we're talking about the valves of the artery. This would be correct. However, not in the veins. Therefore, the answer is going to be A. Question number 32. Which statements about arteries are correct? 1. Artery walls can resist high pressure. This is correct due to the high content of elastic fibers. Elastic fibers can stretch and recoil, and stretch to increase or resist the high pressure, and recoil to increase the blood pressure just in case it falls. Therefore, this is correct. 2. Arteries pump blood out of the heart. Now, this is incorrect. What pumps blood out of the heart is the muscular walls. Therefore, this is incorrect. It's not the arteries. The arteries receive the blood coming out of the heart. It does not pump blood out of the heart. 3. Blood in the arteries has the same flow rate as in veins. This is incorrect because blood flow in arteries is the greater, and then as we go to the capillaries, then to the veins, it keeps decreasing, so this is incorrect. 4. The pulse in the arteries is the result of a surge in blood that causes expansion of the artery wall. We just mentioned due to the elastic fibers, it could surge and stretch to increase or decrease the pressure. Therefore, what happens is when it surges, it causes the expansion of the artery wall. When the artery wall expands, it decreases the blood pressure, so that's a way of controlling the blood pressure in the arteries, so it is correct. 5. There are semilunar valves at the junction of arteries with the heart. Now, semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the arteries, therefore this is correct. And the answer is going to be C. Question number 15. What happens during ventricular systole in a mammalian heart? So ventricular systole is the contraction of the ventricles. And then what happens is that the pressure increases in the ventricles and pushes blood outside the semilunar valve to the arteries. Now let's see the suggestions that we have here. 1. The atrioventricular node transmits an electrical signal to the apex of the heart. The wording here is not quite accurate, since what happens is that the right atrium, there's the sinoatrial node, which initiates the electrical excitation. So it's the sinoatrial node that initiates the electrical excitation, which is transmitted to the atrioventricular node. The function of the atrioventricular node is to delay the electrical impulse, not directly transmit it. And then what happens is that delayed electrical impulse moves down the bundle of His, and then what happens is that the flow through the bundle of His goes upwards to the apex of the heart at something called the Purkinje fibers. Now, the Purkinje fibers at the sides of the ventricles is what causes the contraction of the ventricle, not directly the atrioventricular node. As we said, its function is to delay the electrical impulse. Therefore, this is incorrect. 2. The pressure in the ventricles drops below. This is incorrect. We said it increases. The atrioventricular valves close and the semilunar valves open. So the semilunar valves open due to the increase in pressure in the ventricles, and the atrioventricular valves close due to the backflow of blood shutting the atrioventricular node. Since it's only one way, therefore this is the only correct answer, and the answer is going to be D. Question number 16. A shortage of protein in the diet of children can lead to a disease that causes excess tissue fluid to build up in the abdomen, aka edema. What explains why a buildup of excess tissue fluid can occur in this disease? Now, what happens is that when blood moves along the blood vessels, there are two opposing forces which determines whether fluid leaves the blood vessels or not. First of all, there's the osmotic force, both inside and outside the blood vessel, and the water potential. What causes excess tissue fluid to build up in the abdomen, aka fluid leaving the blood vessels, is either a decrease in the osmotic balance inside the blood vessels or an increase in water potential inside the blood vessels. An example for this would be, for example, a decrease in protein. We know that protein constitutes most of the plasma. The plasma is mostly made of protein. Therefore, when protein decreases due to a liver disease, for example, what happens is that the osmotic balance inside the blood vessels decreases. When this happens, the water potential starts to increase. Therefore, since the water potential is higher than the outside, what happens is now fluid, aka tissue fluid, starts accumulating outside or in the abdomen. Now, let's see the suggestions that we have here. A shortage of plasma proteins decreases blood water potential. Less tissue fluid returns to the blood. Now, this is incorrect. B. A shortage of plasma proteins increases blood water potential, as we mentioned here. A decrease in osmotic pressure means water potential increases. So, less tissue fluid returns to the blood, aka tissue fluid accumulates in the abdomen or in these cells. Therefore, this is correct. C. A shortage of protein in the diet causes weak cardiac muscle, reducing hydrostatic pressure. Now, this is incorrect. Here we're talking about water potential and osmotic balance. Plus, hydrostatic pressure does not increase. We said that water potential increases. It does not decrease. So this is incorrect. D. A shortage of protein in the tissue fluid decreases its water potential. As we said, it increases. More water leaves the blood. Therefore, the answer is going to be B. Question number 17. Red blood cells may contain a molecule known as 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. When 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate binds to hemoglobin, a higher partial pressure of oxygen is needed to bring about 50% saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Which statements about the effect of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate are correct? Now, a higher partial pressure of oxygen is needed to bring about 50% saturation indicates that it causes the hemoglobin to have a lower affinity to oxygen. Therefore, the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen decreases. Therefore, the graph or the oxygen dissociation curve shifts to the right. Now, let's see the suggestions that we have here. So, we know that 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. Now, for one, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate in red blood cells causes oxygen dissociation curve to shift to the right. This is correct. As we mentioned earlier, the binding of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate to hemoglobin reduces the Bohr effect. It increases the Bohr effect since the graph shifts to the right. And in Bohr effect, we're actually talking about the carbon dioxide concentration increasing the partial pressure of oxygen needed to bring about a specific saturation, therefore shifting the graph to the right. Therefore, this is incorrect because Bohr effect, we talk about carbon dioxide, not bisphosphoglycerate. Now for 3, the binding of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate to hemoglobin lowers the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. This is correct as we mentioned earlier. Or when 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is not present, oxyhemoglobin is less likely to unload oxygen. So this is incorrect. The reason for this is here we're talking about the affinity during the loading of oxygen, that a higher partial pressure of oxygen is needed to bring about 50% saturation, not the unloading. Therefore, this is incorrect and the answer is going to be B. Question number 18. Carbon dioxide is continually produced by respiring cells. It diffuses into red blood cells and dissociates into hydrogen ions and hydrogen carbonate ions. Hydrogen carbonate ions then diffuses out of the cell in exchange for chloride ions in the chloride shift. What is the importance of the chloride shift? As we mentioned in the previous question, what happens is due to the increased concentration of carbon dioxide inside the red blood cell, what happens is that the enzyme carbonic anhydrase converts carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid, which dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, which is negatively charged. What happens is that the hydrogen ions stay inside the red blood cell because they're impermeable and can't leave, whilst the bicarbonate ions leave the red blood cells, which contain a negative charge. Therefore, what would happen is that the hydrogen ions, which are positively charged, would accumulate inside the red blood cell, causing a net positive charge inside the red blood cell. To balance this phenomenon, there is something called a chloride shift. What happens in the chloride shift is that the chloride ions, which are negatively charged, enter the red blood cell to replace the bicarbonate ions, which are negatively charged, that leave the red blood cell. So there's a net balance. Now let's see the suggestions that we have here. A, it helps to maintain a neutral pH in the red blood cell. Now it's not the pH here, we're talking about positive and negative charges. B, it maintains a balance of positive and negative charges. This is correct due to the reasons we just mentioned. C, it causes the oxygen dissociation curves to shift to the left, releasing more oxygen. This is incorrect, we're talking about the charges. D, it prevents carbon dioxide combining with hemoglobin, allowing hemoglobin to combine with oxygen. This is also incorrect and the answer is going to be B. Question number 19. The photomicrograph shows a section through a structure found in mammals viewed using a light microscope. So first of all, this seems to be an artery. The reason for this is due to the thick layers plus a thin lumen. So it has a thick wall with a thin lumen, so this seems to be an artery. Now, we know whether it's an artery or a vein, it must have three key layers. First of all, the inner one is the tunica intima, constituting of endothelium and basement membrane. Now, and a middle layer called the tunica media, and an external layer called a tunica adventitia. As we said, the inner layer constitutes of endothelium, and tunica media, which is W, constitutes mainly of elastic fibers, muscular fibers, and some collagen fibers. Be aware that both the tunica media and tunica externa have both three, however in different proportions. So the tunica media would have a higher proportion of elastic and muscle fibers than the tunica externa. And the tunica externa consists mainly of collagen fibers. Now, what are the main components of layer W? And here we're going to have to work with the highest proportions. So we know that in the tunica media, the highest proportions are the elastic and the muscular fibers. Therefore, the answer is going to be C. Question number 20. Which statement correctly links muscular or elastic arteries to their function? A. The aorta is an example of a muscular artery. Now this is incorrect, it's actually an elastic artery. It's closer to the heart, therefore it's an elastic artery. B. Arteries further away from the heart are muscular arteries as they transport blood at high pressure. Now, the arteries further away from the heart are muscular. This is correct because they help in the distribution of blood to body tissues. So the accuracy of blood distribution. Now, transport blood at high pressure is incorrect. As we move further from the heart, the pressure keeps decreasing. So this is incorrect. C. Elastic arteries expand when the heart contracts and then recoil as the heart relaxes to maintain pressure. So this is correct. Due to the elastic fibers, they can stretch and recoil to fix the pressure. For example, if the pressure is lower, it could surge to give blood a push to increase the pressure. And it could stretch when the pressure is high. Therefore, this is correct. D. Muscular arteries facilitate smoother blood flow than elastic arteries as their walls expand and recoil. Now, be careful from the wording here. Elastic arteries are what expands and recoils. Muscular artery contracts and relaxes. Therefore, this is incorrect, and the answer is going to be C. Question number 21. The graph shows the changes in pressure that occur in the left side of the heart during one cardiac cycle. What is the heart rate in beats per minute? So, in one cardiac cycle, as mentioned in the question, it is 0.8 seconds. Therefore, in 1 minute, or beats per minute, we would divide 60 by 0.8. And the answer is going to be 75, which is A. Question number 22. Which events occur in ventricular systole? So in ventricular systole, we know that the ventricle contracts. Therefore, what happens is that the pressure in the ventricle increases, pushing blood out and opening the semilunar valves whilst closing the atrioventricular valves. Therefore, what happens is that the atrioventricular valves close. This is correct. And muscles in the ventricle wall relaxes. So this is incorrect because, as we said, the ventricle contracts in the systole, so it actually contracts, doesn't relax. 3. Semilunar valves open. This is correct due to the increased pressure in the ventricle. Therefore, the answer is going to be C. Question number 24. Which plant diagram represents the tissues in a major vein? So whether it's a vein or an artery, we know that they constitute of 3 main layers: tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. Therefore, C is instantly incorrect since it only contains 2 layers. Now, let's see the suggestions that we have here. Using common sense, we know that arteries are what have a narrow lumen like that. And arteries have the thickest tunica media layer. Therefore, both of these seem to be arteries. Now, D seems to have the widest lumen. And we know that veins have the widest lumen, and it contains the 3 layers, so it might be a major vein. Therefore, the answer is going to be D by elimination. However, major veins mostly have a greater tunica externa made of collagen. However, in this question, we'll have to assume that D is a major vein due to the wider lumen, because a feature of veins is that they have a wider lumen than the arteries. Therefore, the answer is going to be D. Question number 25. The diagram shows the pressure changes in various structures of the left side of the heart during the cardiac cycle, at the end of which period is the ventricle full of blood. So here we're looking for the phase atrial systole, or aka ventricular diastole. This period is basically when the atria contracts, it pushes blood to the ventricle. Therefore, the pressure in the ventricle is actually lower and the pressure in the atrium is higher. Now, I'll show you a very easy way in order to interpret this cardiac cycle diagram. First of all, always remember CO, CO. And we must label the lines. So the bottom line is the left atrium. Therefore, the valves here are going to be the atrioventricular valves. And this line is going to be the left ventricle. And since this is the aorta, and the pressure in the aorta increases and decreases, here we're looking at the semilunar valves. So, the bottom is the atrioventricular valves, and above it is the semilunar valves. And I've showed you a mnemonic as CO, CO. So, in this phase, the atrioventricular valves close, while the semilunar valves open, and vice versa. Now we're looking for atrial systole. To interpret this phase, in atrial systole, the atrial pressure increases. So it's going to be this phase right here. This phase, the ventricle is going to be full of blood. Therefore, the correct answer is going to be A. Question number 26. Which description of movement of substances during tissue fluid formation is correct? So, as we discussed earlier, how does tissue fluid move or form? What happens is there is a blood vessel. Two factors that determine whether fluid leaves the blood vessel or not are the osmotic balance, or determines the rate of fluid leaving the blood vessel is the osmotic balance, and the water potential. And the balance between the outside and the inside, osmotic balance and the water potential. Now, what happens is a situation where tissue fluid formation would increase and fluid would leave the blood vessels, so aka tissue fluid formation increases, is a situation, for example, when there's a decrease in osmotic balance. For example, when there's a liver disease which caused a lower protein formation. And we know that plasma constitutes of mainly protein. Therefore, what happens when the protein concentration decreases, osmotic balance decreases. Therefore, the water potential inside the blood vessels increases. Therefore, what happens is, due to the increased water potential inside the blood vessels, it moves now at a greater rate. So fluid moves out of these blood vessels at a greater rate than before. Therefore, tissue fluid accumulates in cells outside. Now, let's see the suggestions that we have here. A low hydrostatic pressure forces substances out of the capillary at the arterial end, allowing small substances to enter the tissue fluid that bathes these cells. So this is totally incorrect. It's high hydrostatic pressure or water potential which forces these substances out, therefore this is incorrect. B. Tissue fluid moves back into the venule due to a net hydrostatic pressure change in the capillary. Now, this is incorrect. Here we're talking about the movement of tissue fluid outside, aka tissue fluid formation. Therefore, this is incorrect. And it moves back due to the osmotic balance, since the osmotic balance at the venule side is actually increased. Therefore, water goes back inside, down water potential gradient. Therefore, this is incorrect. C. Movement of water in tissue fluid into the capillary by osmosis is due to the low water potential and low hydrostatic pressure inside the capillary. Now, here we're talking in reverse. What if tissue fluid moves back into the capillary? What would happen completely the reverse? What would happen is the water potential would decrease and the osmotic balance would increase. Therefore, what happens is now water moves down water potential back inside the capillary. Therefore, this is correct. D. A high water potential of the surrounding tissue fluid causes substances to leave the capillaries. Now, be careful of the wording here. A high water potential in the surrounding tissue. It should be a high water potential in the capillaries. Therefore, this is incorrect. And the answer is going to be C. Question number 27. Which row shows the change in concentration of some substances in red blood cells when carbon dioxide diffuses from active cells? So, when carbon dioxide concentration increases, it combines with water and forms carbonic acid by the action of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase in red blood cells. Then what happens is that it dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions accumulate inside the red blood cells since they are impermeable, whilst the bicarbonate ions leave the red blood cell and being transported in the plasma. Now let's see the suggestions that we have here. So, carbonic anhydrase, it's an enzyme found in red blood cell. Therefore, its concentration is constant no matter what. Therefore, no change. Now, hydrogen carbonate ions, as we said, it increases. And hydrogen ions increases. Therefore, the answer is going to be number 28. The diagram shows a transverse section throughout an artery. Which tissues are present in the layer X? So, we must know that the artery constitutes of three main layers. The artery or a vein. It constitutes of a tunica intima, which is made of an endothelial layer with a basement membrane, tunica media, which is made of muscular or elastic arteries or both, followed by a small proportion of collagen, and tunica externa. Tunica externa constitutes mainly of collagen. Now, which tissues are present in layer X? As we mentioned, it's going to be elastic fibers and smooth muscle with the highest proportion, and only a very small proportion of collagen. Therefore, in this question, we're going to go by elimination. Therefore, elastic fibers and smooth muscle is the correct answer, since we're looking at which ones have the higher proportions. Question number 29. What is systolic blood pressure? So if we say systolic only without specifying if it's atrial or not, therefore we're talking about ventricular systole. So if we see systole by itself, it's ventricular systole. Now, what is ventricular systole blood pressure? Now, this basically means the blood pressure in the ventricle at the maximum rate. So at the systole. Therefore, the answer is going to be D. Question number 30. The diagram shows pressure changes in the left side of the heart and the aorta over time. The length of this cardiac cycle is 0.6 seconds. Points 1, 2, 3, and 4 indicate when atrioventricular valves and semilunar valves either open or close. What is the total time during one cardiac cycle that the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves are both closed at the same time? So, I'm going to show you a way to interpret this graph very easily. It's CO. We must know what these lines represents in the first place. So, the lines at the bottom represents the atrium. Therefore, here we're talking about the atrioventricular valves. So below is the atrioventricular valves. And since here we see the aortic pressure, therefore we're going to be talking about the semilunar valves. And with the mnemonic CO. Now, here they want the time during the cardiac cycle that both valves are closed at the same time. So quite frankly, it's going to be between these two areas. So it's going to be this area here. Therefore, we're going to be adding these two times together. The reason for this is when the semilunar valves, or the atrioventricular valve here closes, this is the start of the ventricular systole. The ventricular systole is the contraction of the ventricle, therefore pushing blood outside the semilunar valves into the atrium. Therefore, we want the milliseconds or fraction of seconds before this takes place, before the ventricular pressure pushes the semilunar valves open. It's going to be this area here and this area here in reverse. Therefore, let's count. It's going to be 0.3 here, 0.03, and here is going to be 0.04. If we add this together, it's going to be 0.07. Therefore, the answer is going to be C. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up, since we're working very hard to provide the best information for you students. Thank you very much for watching this video, and please subscribe and like this video, and wait for part 2.